Welcome back. If you're watching this lesson, then I'm assuming you've watched the video entitled How We Learn. If not, please stop this video and return to that video now. So let's talk about the video. As you can see, our brains are amazing organs that have the ability to learn and grow by creating strong neural connections. However, just like building a bridge, it takes several times for neurons to fire towards each other before a strong neural connection is made. Therefore, to excel as a learner, you need to create as many neural connections as possible. However, if you'll recall from previous lessons, I mentioned that learning is not a spectator sport. I also mentioned that you can't create deep and lasting learning by passively listening to a lecture, casually skimming a textbook, or have a tutor solve the math problems for you. Therefore, if you want to grow as a learner, think about these two questions. First, what specific learning techniques do you use right now that build neural networks? Secondly, what specific learning techniques could you develop to help you build more neural networks? One way you can grow as a learner is to think about learning as a process. Simply put, good learners consciously or unconsciously implement three principles for creating deep and lasting learning. The first principle is to build upon prior learning. In other words, you try to relate new information to previously stored information and build upon foundations you've already learned. For example, if you know how to play a clarinet, learning to play the saxophone will likely be easier for you. Why? Well, you've already established a base of knowledge to build upon. However, if your earlier learning was shaky, you may have trouble progressing without going back to strengthen your foundations. This is the reason for developmental classwork. However, to get this information to stick, you'll need to employ new learning techniques. If you didn't learn with the strategy you employed the last time, how do you think it will work this time around? The second principle of deep and lasting learning involves the quality of processing. In other words, as you learn, you'll need to use numerous and varied deep processing strategies. Think about Olympic sprint runners. If they want to succeed in their sport, they vary their training regimen. Runners do more than run. They lift weights, jump rope, and do calisthenics. Likewise, how you study also affects the strength of your neural networks and the quality of your learning. Therefore, as you study, you'll want to progress beyond memorization to master complex information and skills and determine how information relates to what you're trying to learn. However, you will likely need to employ a little bit of cross-training and try varied approaches to learning. The more ways you deep process new learning, the stronger neural networks become. The third principle of deep and lasting learning involves the quantity of processing. Simply put, when we're talking about quantity of processing, we're talking about spending sufficient time on task. When you cram 2 hours right before an exam, little learning occurs. However, when you study 6 hours over the period of a week, more learning occurs. Why is that? You're utilizing a technique called distributed practice. Simply put, the human brain learns best when learning efforts are distributed over time. So, the best way to increase deep and lasting learning is to use frequent practice sessions of sufficient length distributed over time. I've often heard students say things like, "I don't know why I failed the test. I studied so long." However, the truth is, they spent little time engaged in effective learning and skimmed the textbook trying to memorize very complex information. In reality, although the students studied, they were not doing enough distributed practice to truly learn the material. Therefore, let me also offer one further side note regarding quantity of processing and sufficient time on task. The traditional guideline for a week's studying is 2 hours for each hour of class time. So, If you're in class 15 hours per week, you should be spending 30 hours of time outside of class learning the material. Do you do this? Are you spending sufficient time on task learning the material? If not, I hope you'll begin thinking of ways to increase the time you spend covering the material from your classes. However, to be a successful learner, you need to make sure you're following a process as you learn. 4 general strategies are common to good learners. To remember these strategies, think of the word core. The core learning system is effective because it automatically guides you to employ all 3 of the active learning principles discussed earlier. Here's how it works. In the acronym CORE, the C stands for collecting information. Whether we realize it or not, we are constantly collecting information using our 5 senses. Almost unconsciously, we take in a multitude of sights, sounds, smells, taste, and physical sensations. In college, however, learning needs to be more conscious. To collect information, you'll need to attend class, take notes, actively participate in class, and read the textbook. Secondly, you'll need some process to organize the material that you've collected. When learning in everyday life, we tend to organize collected information unconsciously. However, in a college course, you need to organize information systematically and in multiple ways so that it makes sense to you. In fact, making meaning from collected information is one of the most important outcomes of studying. Third, you'll need to rehearse what you've collected and organized. Rehearsing, also called practicing, strengthens neural networks and makes learning stick. However, you need to remember to distribute your practice sessions over time. So, you may want to try several ways to rehearse, including studying flashcards, discussing the material with a classmate, or even try teaching the material to someone. Finally, you should evaluate your learning or seek feedback to determine if learning has occurred. Evaluation may come in the forms of exams, quizzes, research papers, essays, or anything else that you can think of to determine if learning has occurred. After all, without feedback, we can never be sure if our learning is accurate or complete. Now, although the CORE acronym defines 4 steps, I'd like to point out that such a system doesn't need to be done in a step-by-step process. Steps can be completed out of order. For example, while rehearsing, you may realize you need to collect more information or organize more effectively. You may take a test to evaluate prior learning before you begin collecting new information. Therefore, you may have to move back and forth through the process for effective learning to occur. However, the goal is still the same. By effectively collecting, organizing, rehearsing, and evaluating material, neural pathways are strengthened and true learning occurs. That concludes the information for this lesson. See you next time.